believe it's your latest book, which is about the 16th and 17th century. And I was listening to this interview that you did recently, and you were talking about how the 16th and 17th century is usually overlooked. Historians focus on like particular areas of history during a period of time. So what is it, especially in the 16th and 17th century, that you think is very important for understanding American history?
Well, the fundamental question is, why are we sitting here in North America speaking English? When post-1492, Spain had the first mover's advantage. After all, they're the ones who sponsored the freebooter Christopher Columbus. And in order to understand how London or England, this minor archipelago on the fringes of Europe, was able to advance in the 1500s, you have to understand some sort of history. For example, you have to understand the Protestant Reformation, so-called, with Martin Luther seceding from the Catholic Church, and how King Henry VIII in the 1530s accedes to that particular sect, supposedly because the the Catholics didn't want to give him his divorces. But of course, the hidden agenda, not so hidden agenda, was scooping up Catholic wealth in his kingdom, which then helps a takeoff for England, and then cutting a deal with the Ottoman Turks, the so-called Muslim power, which was often at sword's point with the so-called Catholic powers, speaking of what we would call Spain in particular. And often in my book on the 16th century, I draw an analogy between what happened in the 20th century. That is to say that a turning point in world history that is going to resonate throughout this century was what happened in the 1970s, when Nixon goes to China, cuts a deal with Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party, and on an anti-Soviet basis. So just as the English or King Henry VIII, they break from the Christians to make a deal with the Muslims, you have China, the Chinese Communist Party, it breaks with the socialist camp and makes a deal with the capitalists. Now, yay, I'm not hating on China like so many people today. You know, they got a good deal. You had physical manufacturing plants migrating across the Pacific, helping to create this juggernaut in Asia, which now bids fair to leave US imperialism in the dust with gargantuan consequences for the world. I just ordered this book by the so-called defense intellectual Elbridge Colby, The Strategy of Denial, which is really about war fighting against China, believe it or not. And of course, I'm sure you believe it because of the Woodward Costa book, Peril, suggested just 9 months ago, on the eve of leaving office, Donald J. Trump was threatening to attack China militarily so he could declare a state of emergency and remain in power. What's interesting as well is that once again, our friends in the US left. I happened to be alive during the Cold War, and I was witnessing it up close. And younger generations may be shocked and surprised to find out how so many people in the US left did not oppose the Cold War. They opposed it. They opposed it at the edges. You know, they opposed the war in Vietnam. And hell, at the end, even the U.S. ruling class opposed the war in Vietnam. So that's no big deal. And I'm about to read this other book by John Pomfret, the former Pomfret, the former Washington Post reporter, From Warsaw with Love. And it's about how today Poland is like the 51st state. I mean, that's where many of the so-called prisoners from Guantanamo and elsewhere were sent on rendition to be tortured. And so I recall during the Cold War, all these people on the left were doing cheerleaders for these people to come to power in Poland. Now they don't have a word to say. I doubt if they even know what's going on. I mean, no wonder we're in trouble. These people, they don't keep up. They don't keep up with what's going on. And so they should turn to selling insurance or selling used cars if they can find them. But certainly they should abandon politics.
Yes, I think I might be one of them because I learned quite a few new facts right here during this this response. But yeah, Sam, I don't know if you had anything. If not, I want to move on to the 18th century. But yeah, go ahead.
Just because we spoke about your recent book, I was just reading it, and it's a great book, by the way, fantastic book. I highly recommend it to everyone. I was just wondering, you do a great job of doing a historical analysis of explaining how racism works its way through Europe, from like it's Protestant against Catholics, and then the Jewish people are marginalized, and then it moves to like North Africa with the Berbers and all that. So I was just wondering, do you think out of that, and if you like, would you like to expand a bit, because I'm sure I did a terrible job of summarizing it. So
no, that was good. That was good. I mean, so basically, what happens is that the Spanish, who have a first mover's advantage, as I've often said, I think they take religion too seriously. Insofar as you could be an African in Cuba in the 1500s, and you could be a conquistador, a conqueror, if you profess Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
And they also unleash the Inquisition of forcing the Muslim population, the Jewish population. Of course, the Muslims, or certain Muslim forces, have been ruling a good deal of what is now the Iberian Peninsula for 700 years, up until 1492. And then when the Christians surged back into power, they imposed the Inquisition. You know, you had to become Catholic or die, or at best be tortured. And of course, you have an abandonment of the Iberian Peninsula, particularly by the Sephardim, the Jewish population. But the Protestants, who were the scrapping underdogs, speaking of London, and also the Netherlands too, which of course had been taken over by the Spanish for a good deal of the 1500s. These were, quote, sects, unquote. They needed every warm body they could muster, particularly if they wanted to compete with Catholic Spain. And so they moved from religion as an axis of society to, quote, race. And what this allows them to do, it allows the English to co-opt those with whom they had been warring, the Irish, the Scots, the Welsh. Interestingly enough, as I pointed out in my 1776 book, as the British Empire decomposes, you see the Scots as today saying, wait a minute, you know, what kind of deal do we have with London? It's time for us to secede, become independent. We can get a better deal with Brussels, with the European Union, than with London. And so likewise, you see England, which had expelled this Jewish population in the 13th century. By the 1500s, of course, they have a change of mind because they're under the gun. And so they welcome the Jewish population. Now, of course, these scholars with their heads in the clouds, and then they start to prattle and prate about enlightenment. They saw the light, but actually they needed warm bodies to confront these indigenous people and enslave the Africans. And so that leads those who had been warring on the shores of Europe, English versus Irish, English versus Scots, English versus Welsh, British versus German, German versus Pole, Pole versus Russian, Northern Italian versus Southern Italian, Serb versus Croat. I mean, the list is endless. All of a sudden, when they cross the Atlantic, they become, quote, white, unquote. Mm-hmm. And then the same people today who like to use this term identity politics to describe what's happening in my community, they have nothing to say about the identity politics of, quote, whiteness, unquote. They don't even, I doubt they even know it exists. I mean, which is crazy. This is lunacy. But to expand it further, to an extent, this whiteness is a product of pan-Europeanism. As I said in The Nation, the left-leaning weekly, the United States, in many ways, no insult to the European Union intended, but it was like a bloodier version of the European Union, the settler colonial project. You had all these people from Europe, but they had a more coercive regime. That's why no insult intended to Brussels. They might have to cut a deal with Brussels. But it's bigger than that, because you can be Lebanese Christian and be defined as white. Look at Ralph Nader. You could be Iranian Jewish, like some of these people in Beverly Hills. You could be defined as white, unquote. But some of us could never be defined as white. And that becomes like sort of this exploitative axis of society, which should be intuitively obvious to the most casual of observers, but somehow has eluded many of our friends on the left, because even after the Virginia election, they get uncomfortable when you start talking about race and racism, for example, which I don't understand, because it's there. Why don't you want to talk about it? But to an extreme degree, I do understand it, because if you go back and look at the history of settler colonialism, there's this metaphor that people in the United States use, circling the wagons. You probably heard it before. What that refers to is, is the settlers, as they're invading Native American land, in their wagons with the horses pulling the wagon. The Native Americans attack, right? And so they have to circle the wagons in order to form a defensive perimeter so they can fight back against the Native Americans. And so I think that deeply embedded in the darkest recesses of these people defined as white, unquote, is this idea of being under assault, under attack by angry Native Americans and obstreperous Africans, of which there are many, because these people can help themselves in importing enslaved Africans to North America, even when it was clear that they were just importing more grave diggers, but like a drug addict, hopelessly hooked on the euphoria of profits delivered by free labor, they couldn't help themselves but import more Africans. And so now they have this psychosis of circling the wagons to the point where they can't even talk about, like, the Virginian election in any sort of concrete manner, because it's too fearful. It brings up too many nightmares about being attacked in their beds by angry Africans in the middle of the night, for example, or attacked by Native Americans who they subjected to genocide.